All right, good morning. We're back with Senate Judiciary. It's February 19th. We have Commissioner Demmel from the Department of Corrections to provide some thoughts about S3.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. My name is Nick Demmel. I'm the Commissioner of Corrections for the state of Vermont. Appreciate the opportunity to testify here today. I think you heard a little from the governor's office, from the Attorney General's office. I'm happy to talk about how the Department of Corrections interacts with the federal government and why we think that that's valuable. And then really open up so that you can ask any questions that they think are important. So the Department of Corrections currently primarily has a contract with the United States Marshal Service. And the goal of that contract is to allow the federal government to detain individuals in Vermont who are arrested for a crime in Vermont, but are going to be prosecuted in the federal criminal system. We have an agreement that allows us to house up to 80 individuals. It usually runs less than that for the Marshal Service. And these are primarily Vermonters who have been arrested for a federal crime in Vermont. I think the last time I talked to the Marshal Service about that, there's something like 250 individuals awaiting criminal proceedings in the U.S. District Court. So we're taking a small percentage of the total number of folks, and that's really a capacity issue on our side. But the federal government has very limited options in New England to house criminal defendants while they're awaiting trial. And so they look to states and often counties, although we don't have county government structure here that supports that, to help with that. They pay the state a per diem rate, and that all goes to the general fund. So the Department of Corrections doesn't collect that money. It all goes straight to the general fund. There's a couple of reasons that I think that's really important that we provide that service. One, if that service were not, it would majorly disrupt the ability for the federal court in Vermont to operate. You would be moving folks hours a day to try to get the criminal proceedings. You'd be doing that frequently. It'd be a major tax on the federal resources that are available. Whereas we have facilities that are within 20, 30 miles of the federal court where we can house these folks so that they can go through their criminal proceedings. I think the other issue is these are folks who have committed crime here and are being prosecuted here. And I think that there is something to be said for housing them in the area, putting them in the court in the area that they're being prosecuted, to be able to provide that type of services. This has been the practice of Vermont for as long as anybody on my staff can remember. We've long supported the Marshal Service request in this way, much like our New York and New Hampshire counterparts do. And so the interruption of that, I think, would be a major change for our state and for the people who are in the criminal justice system at the federal level. On top of that, the federal government has asked us to house temporary ICE detainees. So those are folks who are detained in Vermont, being suspected of either committing a crime or, more often, being in the country illegally. Those numbers are quite small. They're usually kept in our system for less than 72 hours, and then they're moved to the administrative law process, which I'm not an expert in, so I won't go too deeply into, but under the federal code. So, for example, today we have 4 ICE detainees in our system. That, like I said, that's a very small percentage of folks that we're dealing with. We've not observed any changes in trends since the administration change in January. We did see in early fall, kind of October-ish timeframe, a spike as the previous administration ramped up its border enforcement. And we've heard from our federal partners in the Customs and Border Protection that there has been a significant uptick in border crossings in this area, but that's outside our scope of authority, so defer to them. So all this is to say, if you were to take on this legislation as it's currently written, I would strongly encourage you to take testimony from the U.S. District Court, from the Chief Judge, from our federal law enforcement partners, and have them explain how majorly this would impact the criminal justice system in Vermont. Beyond that, I'm happy to answer questions, but I would concur with Jay Johnson, who spoke before me, that this feels like a pretty big impingement on the executive's authority to execute the government. And I would encourage you to rethink some drafting of this issue.
Yeah, so just a response to and some questions. I think it's, I feel like I've expressed a few times, I don't know, I don't think you've been here, but you know, the idea of constraining the governor's ability to enter into agreements, that's not something, in my opinion, that's going to move forward. You know, this bill as it's written is essentially a placeholder to carry on this conversation about what we can and can't do regarding immigration. I'm not aware of anything that would change or any intent of changing agreements with the U.S. Marshals, but rather this is mainly focused on addressing immigration issues, you know, like with ICE, for instance. So I guess my question was, one, was there somewhere in this bill that discusses agreements with the U.S. Marshals that I didn't catch?
So we don't have a standalone agreement with ICE or with CBP. The contract, it's called an intergovernmental agreement between the state and the federal government, is with the United States Marshals Service. As part of that, they have added a rider years and years ago to include ICE and CBP. And for those who aren't aware, CBP is the enforcement agency that conducts law enforcement activity, and ICE is the immigration authority. So folks are typically, almost always, arrested by CBP, brought to us, and they are transferred to ICE custody at that point. Because ICE is not the kind of adjudicating agency. So that's why there's kind of both. They're linked, if you will. But our agreement is actually with the Marshal Service. So that's why I spend so much time focusing on that. And feel very strongly that the state should continue to have its agreement with the United States Marshal Service.
Senator Bones?
And I can certainly understand why it would make sense to have an agreement that people who are charged with a crime in Vermont have the ability to be housed in Vermont. And I wonder if you view, and I recognize you're not the policymaker, but if you view a way in which this policy could be crafted to say that marshal arrangement is fine without the ICE and CPP component. Because I do have an issue actually using beds, because my understanding is immigration violations are civil violations. And so I do have an issue.
It's a separate process. You're right. If I can, just for a moment, I mean, taking a position on whether the state should or should not interact with ICE more broadly, I will say Vermont not housing the individuals during that initial period doesn't mean they aren't going to be detained. It means they're going to be detained somewhere else. And from my perspective, I know what services I can provide them in our system. I know that many of the folks who are detained come in with very serious illnesses that are uncommon in the broader community, like tuberculosis. I know that we can provide them the care and recovery that they need during the period that we have them. I know they get immediate medical attention. I know that they get housing, food, and the type of food they get, because it's the same that we would provide anybody else who's in our custody. I don't know what they're going to get somewhere else. And, I think I'm reticent to just push this problem somewhere else. And I'm not saying that's what we're trying to do here, but I think we can provide these folks a degree of service that I can't guarantee they're going to get somewhere else. And so I'm at least inclined to try. Now, back to your review question, could we decouple the ICE and CBP agreements? I imagine there is a way to do that. I don't know off the top of my head. But I think it's coming through quite clearly, and it sounded like you agree. I don't want to jeopardize our relationship with the United States Marshal Service. So that would be kind of, I think, something for the governments to work out between each other. And I think legislating the space starts to make that a little more complicated, but that's certainly beyond my authority to tell you what to do.
Senator, just to follow up on that. So given this bit of statute that we've been talking about today, I'm assuming that the agreement you're talking about comes under the governor's authority. So I don't see a way that we could write a bill that he would allow to go through, given Jay Johnson's testimony this morning in that area. But I am wondering more broadly. So putting this bill aside, or this approach aside, you understand where the concerns are coming from. We're a border state ourselves. So at some point, it feels to me like this administration is going to be moving their attention from the southern border to the northern border, and we could see things that we haven't seen before, or approaches that we haven't seen, or, to my mind, federal overreach that we haven't seen before. So you said that the trends right now are not worrisome. What if the trends become worrisome? What would that look like, and what would you contemplate doing in that instance?
So, we watch that data very closely. We get a daily snapshot. I happen to have ours in front of me. We watch that trend line very carefully. We know kind of the normal spikes. So Mondays, there tends to be a spike, but it's because there's no proceedings, no movement over the weekend. So more folks get accumulated up, and then Monday, and then there's usually a decrease after that, and the week kind of levels out. We have, as I mentioned, we have seen upticks in border enforcement over, I've been here for 3.5 years. Over the last 3.5 years during the previous administration, particularly last October, I'd call out, we had a major spike in both the number of folks that were being brought to us and the number of folks, I think, that the federal government was claiming were crossing illegally the border. So what would we do about that? I mean, the major limitation for us is capacity. We simply don't have a lot of extra capacity, and we've carved out a little bit of capacity for the federal government. We wouldn't be able to take a major influx of folks.
And what would the top number be?
I think the highest that I've seen in the time that I've been commissioner is somewhere in the mid-20s.
What would that be? Suppose, what could you do if there was pressure from the federal government to do more?
Well, so as far as I understand, the federal government doesn't have the authority to force a state to hold folks. We do it under an agreement with the federal government, basically as a service. So we simply could say no and not take them into our custody. There have been rare instances where we know that folks are there longer than they should be. And we have flagged that for the federal government. I think there was some process breakdown on their side. That would be another instance. If we were to keep people, if an immigration detainee were to come in and be there for 3 weeks, that would be a big problem for the federal government. Under federal law, maybe a violation of their due process program. So those are kind of triggers that I would look to, is what's our daily census, what changes in trend have we seen, and then is the length of stay changing. Those would be kind of red flags.
And then my last thing, and that's somewhat comforting. But my last thing would be, suppose the federal government conditions money to corrections on detaining the number of people that they tell you to detain, and they condition federal funding, in the way that highway funding has been conditioned over the years. Is that an irrational fear, or is that something that you could see happening and tying your hands?
It's a very good question. So I think there's two parts to the federal funding. There's what we get paid for, like the per diem rate that we get for individuals being housed with them. I mean, frankly, we don't need that money. That money really probably barely or doesn't cover the cost of the person actually being there. So it's not like the state's making money on this. We're not. We're probably losing a good deal of money. We could simply absorb that. It would just go away. On the other side, other federal funding, of course, is the Department of Corrections. So federal funding in our budget makes up only about 2%. It's usually for discrete projects or specific things. So for example, we have a federal grant to support some of our education work, but it's not a substantial amount of money. And so if the federal government were to say, you're gonna get no federal funding unless you do immigration, you wouldn't, there would be an up in our budget, but it would be about 2%.
Okay.
The rest of the DOC budget is general fund. And I know that's different than our Agency of Transportation or
Yeah.
even the Department of Health that gets a substantial part of its funding from the federal budget.
Okay.
So I don't think they have a lot of leverage, is it, at my point.
Again, reassuring.
Yeah, right.
Is the federal government paying for the full cost of detaining somebody for the couple of days that they're in, if they're
So they pay a per diem rate. I think it's $135. We check that per person per day. That, you know, it's difficult for us to say this is exactly how much it costs to house somebody in a facility every day because many of those costs are fixed. They would be there whether we had a person in a bed or not. So it's hard to do the math that way. But no, we would generally estimate that it costs more to house somebody than $135. But that number is set by the federal government. It's not set by the state. And we have worked with the marshals to renegotiate that. I think we have the highest per diem rate in the country for any federal detention arrangement. And that's because we put a lot of pressure on them. But there are other instances where the federal government has provided support to the state to kind of offset that. For example, with infrastructure projects and things like that.
thank you, Senator Moulton.
Yeah, so I have a couple of things. One, I just want to sort of clarify that our capacity is based on how many people we can humanely house. And they certainly have plenty of instances through history where that was ignored, whether or not it was humane to house more people in a specific space. But sort of to a larger issue, I'm wondering what the process is currently in place for DOC sharing information with ICE. So say someone was detained for something that had nothing to do with immigration, is that information proactively being shared?
So the easy answer to that is no. We don't have any data sharing agreement. We don't provide any information to the federal government that isn't in exchange, you know, so hey, federal government shows up with a detainee, this is the person, when they come to pick them up, hey, you know, this is the data back. So we don't provide any data sharing. Now, I'll caveat that I don't quite understand what access ICE has to federal criminal databases, but much of the sensitive data that DOC has actually lives in what are called CJIS systems, so federal criminal justice systems. So for example, your criminal record can be accessed by the FBI, even if DOC is the one who put it in or a Vermont law enforcement agency. So it's possible that, and I honestly don't know, it's possible that ICE has access to those systems also. But that's not something that DOC or the state of Vermont is specifically sharing. Those are how, and Senator, you may know better than I do with your law enforcement background, those are how the criminal justice information systems are structured. Usually they're funded and facilitated by the FBI.
Okay, and that's helpful, but if someone is being detained, say because they can't pay bail and they have not been actually convicted of any crime, is that information in a federal system?
No.
Is that information being
No,
shared? Is that?
That information, there may be some information in what we call our offender management system, that's DOC proprietary system. That information, we don't share information out of there. Most of the data that I think you're talking about would be in the Odyssey system, which is our state court information system.
And is there anything at this point in time prohibiting a change to where that is proactively being shared?
I'm not sure I understand. We
So
don't
currently
intend
you
to,
are not in the practice of doing it, but
Right.
there is nothing prohibiting you from doing it.
I'm not sure if there's something prohibiting us. We don't control Odyssey. That would be the
Yeah,
courts.
okay.
For our OMS system, we have not been in the practice of sharing that information with anybody.
Excellent.
And most of it, well, maybe that's not true. I was gonna say most of it isn't particularly sensitive, but it's largely biographical data, or data related to criminal charges. And then there's like DOC data that wouldn't be relevant to anybody, like how we do movement or where somebody is living at a particular moment within our system. But that information isn't shared outside of the DOC. And I imagine, though I don't know for sure, but we can certainly check. I imagine our own policies and probably some state law prevent us from sharing that.
Because I don't want to see, I mean, I could imagine in maybe not Vermont, I'm glad to hear it's not the practice, you know, somebody is, say, picked up on a charge of prostitution and it is determined that they are not documented, and that is shared outwardly. And down the road, it's determined actually they're a trafficking victim. And now we've created a mass because we proactively called up ICE or CBP or whomever it is to say, hey, we've got this undocumented person here.
Yeah, that activity is not.
And I would be curious to know if there's anything under current state law that would prohibit that from happening.
Certainly, we can run that track.
Thank you.
Any further questions, comments? Okay. Any further testimony?
No, sir.
Well, thank you for coming in. Appreciate it. So I don't think we have anyone else on the list for 44 at the moment. Is there any general discussion, thoughts about the bill?
As I indicated to Jay, I like the suggestion of the ACLU of eliminating this. This at page 3.
It's only a page and
At the end. Because I think it steers clear of the governor's authority. In fact, there's an argument to be made that increases the governor's authority by eliminating this provision. And, the president has made it very clear that he won't be shy about calling something an emergency that might well just be purely political in nature. And so this says in the event of a national emergency, the governor doesn't need to be signing the agreements. And to me, that's a gaping loophole given what the federal government is.
Yeah, I put a star next to that because I was trying to figure out what you were getting at earlier. To follow up on.
But that's a piece that we could do in the bill structure that we have without going too far.
Yeah. Senator Wilson.
I would like to hear again from the Attorney General on the ACLU sort of suggestions across the board, because I think they bring up good points that this isn't simply about immigration. It's about First Amendment rights. It's about reproductive rights. It's about things that I believe we as a state value. And I certainly, while we have not seen this happening, we have not seen the exact same things happening in Vermont as we have in other states. I'm seeing, Tennessee just yesterday passed out of committee a law that would make it illegal for state legislators to vote in opposition to immigration policy coming from the federal government. And while I don't think we would do that, I would in fact hope we go in the other direction to really firmly protect, yes, people who are here for a number of reasons, but also First Amendment rights. And, I don't want to see people starting to get arrested by anyone because they're protesting or because they disagree. I think we're going down a dangerous path in a lot of places and want to really shore that up.
Sure. Anything further?
I'm good at this point.
Okay. All right. Yeah, we can follow up with the AG. I think they have to step out of the room after a short time, but yes, we can revisit. And I think
They haven't had a chance to see it either, so I'd like to give them time to actually read it.
Yeah, and I think it is worthwhile exploring the suggestion that you made regarding 4652 subsection B.
I do have a question here. Senator Bruce. What is your opposition to leaving the city? What are the intentions to accomplish by removing?
Well, so as I understand it, that in 2017, the intent was to give the governor the power over these agreements with law enforcement agencies. So you didn't have a rogue agency here or there just doing whatever they wanted. So now the governor has that power. Jay made it clear the governor doesn't intend to give up that power. That they see that, as do I, as fully constitutional. But what this says is if President Trump declared a national emergency around the northern border or around immigration just generally, under this, as I read it, and it basically negates the segment above it. It says notwithstanding subsection A, and then it gives those same local law enforcement agencies the ability to enter into the agreements, which is contrary to the whole point. So it seems that the governor should welcome getting rid of that clause, not oppose it. And that's what I heard from Jay. is that they wouldn't have any real opposition to it, but she thinks we should listen to other law enforcement agencies about whether they can make an argument that they need that power, but I can't see that they would. In other words, they need a power over and above the governor, which I don't see how that would be the case. Does that make sense?
I'm trying I don't understand what harm it has by remaining there.
Well,
No one in the state of Vermont is doing this, but what if is all I'm saying. That goes back to, we don't know what's coming up, right? It seems like most of our efforts should be in place towards what's happening at a federal level. Everyone's in a state of panic. We really don't know if it's going to affect Vermont. I'm sure the possibility is there. But my concern is how much movement we move forward with the administration we're presently looking at. At what point in time do we become a sanctuary state? At what point in time do we lose those much needed federal funding that comes into the state of Vermont here?
and that's a good caution. I think getting rid of this particular provision doesn't move us closer to being a sanctuary state. It reaffirms the governor's sole power to enter into these contracts. Whereas the way this reads now, if there's a state or a national emergency, these individual actors out there who are running individual law enforcement agencies would be empowered to themselves make the decision about whether they enter into these agreements. So I feel like what I'm doing here by suggesting, and the ACLU is actually consolidating the governor's power, which is not moving in the direction of the sanctuary state, but to a state where the governor is making those calls case by case.
Yeah, I think if we're to look at this committee discussion, I think I'd like to look at on an individual basis. It's like if we have a natural disaster or whatever else, all of the resources that the state of Vermont has. Say we got a natural disaster that covers from the Canadian border down through Montpelier. Well, we only have a limited number of resources available to the state of Vermont. So any law enforcement agency, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, but they're going to prioritize using the Vermont State Police as a they're going to prioritize where they send their resources at that particular point in time. So I've always been of the contention that our first responders are, I'm going somewhere with this, our first responders are going to be our best asset. So if we do have a national emergency or whatever, so I don't know what that looks like, because I've only been around for a couple of decades here. But if we do have that, why would we strip any law enforcement agency because the state is concentrated on another part of the state with the ability to say, yeah, we need help right now. We don't need to wait until the governor gives us the blessing here because we want to protect our citizens here in the county or whatever else. That's the part that I'm.
Well, so first of all, I think this governor has shown in an emergency, he has the bandwidth to, cover what's necessary in emergencies. I think in your example, it's not going to be like there's a week delay, somebody would make a phone call to the governor, he would approve it, and then they would sign the agreement. Or if he didn't approve it, they wouldn't sign the agreement. But what I'm talking about is Donald Trump has begun to, in a clear bid to increase his authority, he's begun to call things an emergency, issue an executive order saying this is an emergency, therefore I now have 3 times the power in this area that I would have. And so immigration is his number one area where he's doing this. So it seems pretty possible to me that the governor's power could be superseded by somebody running a law enforcement agency somewhere in the state of Vermont says, I'm a loyal supporter of the president. He issued a declaration of emergency under this provision of law. I now have the ability to single-handedly enter into contracts without the governor's approval. And so what I'm arguing for is that the governor should be brought in all of these instances, whether there's an emergency or not.
I would also interject in that it wouldn't involve natural disasters. It's specifically for 1357 or 1401 contracts with the federal government.
I'll just use that as an example. We have a natural disaster. We have a limited amount of resources. We're going to put those resources. They're going to prioritize where we put those resources. And I'm saying that in this particular situation, if we did have a natural disaster, not a natural disaster, but a state of emergency, I think we have limited resources, and the state would prioritize as to where they put those resources. It's kind of like beckoning back to not cutting their arms off roadside, or the use of the illegal tow code if it's your only means of. And I think by doing this, I don't ever see this happening, but then once again, that's all I'm saying. What it is taking away the possibility of someone being able to enter into agreement to help the residents of their city, their county, whatever.
I mean, one quick thing, I would disagree that we're taking something away by doing this. I mean, this is, the opportunity is still there. It's, however, something that would have to be authorized by the governor, which, you know, I don't think is necessarily a bad idea in the event that some sort of state of emergency specifically related to immigration is imposed in Vermont. But that's just not.
And
About that. Senator Host.
oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I remain unconvinced that there is a state of emergency that requires such rapid action related to immigration that we can't have checks and balances. And it's not a matter of if the president declares the state of emergency, he already is declaring the state of emergencies. So I don't think immigration emergencies are the same as a flood or a fire in which this doesn't apply.
If I might, there's also nationally, and I won't say here, but nationally, there's something called the sovereign sheriff movement.
The sovereign one,
Sheriff, where there are, you know, sheriffs out there who believe that they're operating independently as kind of, you know, semi-sovereign entities. And they have been very supportive of Donald Trump. And so one of the things we're talking about is, should state lawmakers and the governor be making a policy around how we're responding to ICE? Or should individual law enforcement officers leading in Vermont, very small agencies sometimes be empowered to do that? And what I see this doing, the suggestion that we get rid of this, is that it reaffirms the idea that the governor is making policy in that area, and that the governor is a guarantor of the state's policy around ICE. But if we leave this in, I could see a single sheriff or somebody running a small law enforcement agency just saying, just reading the plain language of this would say, of course I have the authority. I'm going to enter into my own agreement and, you know, take me to court if you think otherwise.
what we're saying is, and I can agree to this, is by removing this section, it gives sole power to the governor to enter agreements that would dictate that section 14652 is simply stricken.
Yeah.
Upon approval from the General Assembly, that's gone.
Gone.
And I would assume it's going to be gone anyways, but I mean, we're virtually saying take that out. It's no longer exists.
And I think that's where the chair went almost immediately with the bill. What I'm talking about is how to accomplish something with the bill that speaks to at least one of the dangers proceeding.
I'm certainly willing to listen to more testimony on it moving forward, but if you remove that section, you take it from something from there. If you remove it,
Something from the
you
legislature.
say we're not taking nothing from them by removing that section. But if you remove the section, you can take something from it.
I would disagree. You just have to get approval from the governor. You can
You
still.
just have to get approval. So you're taking the ability for them to do it on their own from them. And now they have to go to the governor anyways. That's just a bone of contention, but let's, I'm willing to take more testimony on it. I'm not saying I'm against it. Just want to make sure that I know exactly where you're accomplishing.
Yeah.
I think it's just a quick funny note. I think it's just kind of funny and ironic. The bill has morphed after testimony from constraining the governor to consolidating power, and that's to the governor. for this specific issue.
And now that's the sticking point.
Yeah, Senator Mosley.
I agree in removing that piece. I don't agree that it is unconstitutional to constrain power that we gave to the governor. And I don't think it is inherently a wrong thing to do to have multiple checks and balances. So I would sit on the other side of that original piece of like getting legislative like working in collaboration between the governor and the legislature to move forward in these agreements. But I do agree that an individual sheriff or an individual municipal police entity should be able to enter into these, and it's already happened. I mean, my understanding is the Essex County Sheriff is already suing the Criminal Justice Council to say, you can't tell us what to do in terms of fair and impartial policing.
Yeah.
So it is not an issue.
Anything further?
I would just say I agree with where you started. I also look at the original bill and don't myself see necessarily a constitutional issue that would shoot it down. I do think we're in a world where the governor has veto power. Our ability to override is non-existent. So gubernatorial power is one area where, given my experience with this administration, I know exactly what they would do. So I think the chair is wise in not taking us down that road, but looking for alternate paths where theoretically we could get a bill signed. And it seems like this is the way to begin.
I think there's lots of avenues to that, and we are still a separate branch of government that should do what we think is best.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do we have, clean copies of S3?
We do have. I
No.
don't. He wasn't there. He said he might.
Okay.
All that stuff.
We can adjourn.